Chapter 981 Peculiarity of the Abyssal Rift, Part 2. After about 12 hours of silence, Lilith couldn't help but mutter to herself, bored. Eh? Fire Sorrow had been immersed in reading a rather thick book, but upon hearing Lilith's voice she raised her head and looked at her in surprise. Did you say something? Although she hadn't meant to be heard and had simply said it subconsciously after a long wait with no results of anything, Lilith responded honestly. I said I'm bored. She shrugged. Without waiting for a response from Fire Sorrow, Lilith rested her back on the back of the chair and leaned her head back before muttering, I'm sorry, but I'll go sleep in the meantime. There's no point in waiting just because. If Lilith had known that this would happen, she certainly wouldn't have rushed over but would have spent another day or two together with Xietain on Earth. Unfortunately, it was already too late to want to carry out her thoughts, so she could only do what Xietain had reminded her worked perfectly to let time pass without her noticing. Sleep. Sleep? Fire Sorrow's eyes widened slightly and a flash of surprise shone in their deep violet pupils. She looked at Lilith, who now had her eyes closed with obvious intentions of going to sleep, and said in amazement, Lilith, if I remember correctly you said in the past that sleeping is a big waste of time, isn't it? How did you? The vast majority of higher existences, probably more than 95% of them, stayed awake since they didn't really need to sleep, and as long as they were out of combat and didn't do too strenuous activities they would always be full stamina. They preferred to spend their time searching for treasures, resources, training, or even fighting against other factions to become stronger. As for sleeping, they saw the action of sleeping as a great waste of time and a waste of opportunities. Lilith gently opened her beautiful ruby-colored eyes, and as she looked up at the distant stone ceiling above her head, she replied in a low, somewhat sleepy voice, "MHM. I guess. I'm learning to enjoy the little things in life." Her eyes closed automatically, softly, and soon her breathing became smooth. Despite having fallen asleep, however, Lilith's body was considerably tense as evidence that she didn't feel safe where she was and that she was alert enough of the outside world to react to any sign of danger. Fire Sorrow stared at Lilith with a slightly amazed expression on her beautiful face, and after a few minutes muttered to herself, enjoying the little things in life. Those words sure bring back some memories. When Fire Sorrow looked back down at her book, and even though it was one of her favorites, she no longer felt like reading any further. She looked at Lilith again and her lips curved slightly as she said softly, "You have changed, bloody succubus Lilith." Fire Sorrow could clearly remember the day Lilith joined the demonic army about a decade ago. Back then, regardless of her beauty and abominably high talent, Lilith was even worse than most higher existences. She was not much different from a machine devoid of all emotion that moved with a clear goal in mind, unwilling to forge the slightest of relationships, unwilling to speak more than just and necessary, and unwilling to compromise even with her own life. It was hard for her to associate the woman in front of her with that cold and even cruel female demon. And Fire Sorrow could say that Lilith's changes had started not long ago, since before the previous meeting she was the bloody succubus they all knew. But, whatever it was that had or was making Lilith change, Fire Sorrow was happy for her, as this Lilith was not only nicer but the change was certainly for the better. To her surprise, Fire Sorrow found herself yawning, and as she looked at the book on the table she could feel her eyelids closing to the point where she soon began to nod as a wave of exhaustion hit her without warning. How long had it been since she had slept? Fire Sorrow didn't know, but probably a few thousand years. Approximately 4 hours later, a portal as black as the wings of a raven opened in a corner of the meeting room, and a Lucifer dressed in black pajamas made of silk cloth walked out from inside. The wolf-headed slippers on the front made no sound at all every time he took a step forward, but when Lucifer paid better attention to the situation his movements froze and he subconsciously stopped breathing. What's going on here? Seeing Lilith sleeping comfortably in her chair with her head resting on the backrest, and even more shocking, seeing Fire Sorrow leaning gently on the table and resting the right side of her face on the open book, Lucifer was stupefied. Could it be? Could it be that someone cast some kind of sleeping skill or something? Lucifer sniffed the air several times in an attempt to discover some kind of particular scent capable of inducing people into deep sleep, but found nothing strange at all after several tries. Actually, he knew that nothing supernatural was going on. It was just that Lucifer found it hard to believe exactly because nothing supernatural was happening. He walked to the main seat and sat down without making a sound as he looked at the two sleeping women. His eyes stopped mainly on Fire Sorrow, and after he turned his gaze to Lilith, a glint of gratitude shone in his light green pupils. Whatever was going on, Lucifer could tell it had to do with Lilith. Soon, he found himself yawning, and before he knew it he joined the two women, sleeping comfortably with his forehead resting on the table and his arms casually outstretched. Surprisingly, and although his posture was not elegant at all, somehow he didn't look much worse than the two beautiful women sleeping a short distance from him. The first to wake up was Lilith, whose eyes slowly and gently opened 2 hours after the arrival of the leader and founder of the demonic army. Her expression was truly a wonder to appreciate as her gaze fell upon the beautiful violet-haired lady and the golden-haired gentleman whose hair was as long as a woman sleeping nonchalantly. Not long after, perhaps an hour later, Fire Sorrow opened her eyes and stared dazedly at the wall with her face still resting on the open book. Somehow she felt as a newborn would probably feel when opening their eyes for the first time to life. I fell asleep? Fire Sorrow mumbled to herself as she slowly straightened her body using her hands on the stone table as support. When Fire Sorrow realized where she was and what had happened, she immediately looked in Lilith's direction and her violet eyes met two bright ruby-colored eyes looking calmly at her. Lilith simply nodded silently, and Fire Sorrow smiled slightly as she nodded back at her, but for a completely different reason than the "I hope you slept well" nod from Lilith. Fire Sorrow's nod was one that showed her gratitude, but Lilith probably hadn't understood the message. After all, she hadn't done anything great in her eyes. Looks like a pajama party formed without us even realizing it. Fire Sorrow whispered under her breath as she looked at Lucifer snoring softly with his head resting on the table. Pajama party? Lilith was slightly dazed as she remembered how much fun that night at Bizemin's house had been. Approximately 40 minutes later, the giant stone door opened from the outside and a person wearing night black plate armor of imposing appearance and holding a spear of the same color in her right hand walked into the room, with firm and confident steps. This female with snow-white hair and eyes of the same color looked silently at the two women who turned to look in the direction of the entrance and nodded back at them before calmly sitting down in front of Fire Sorrow and on the opposite side of Lucifer. After a brief silence, Fire Sorrow looked at the tip of the spear where there were stains of dried golden blood, and asked with a faint smile, "Did you hunt something good, Lucia?" "I had the intention, but the prey had allies so he got away, but I managed to tear off several scales," Lucia replied indifferently. "So, what dragon are we talking about?" Fire Sorrow asked slowly. "It's Bringer of the End." Lucia looked at her and said calmly, "For the record, they started it." The corner of Fire Sorrow's mouth twitched a couple of times, but she said nothing. Bringer of the End, a giant 7th Order dragon only slightly weaker than Doom Roar. Such a beast had actually taken a beating from Lucia without even inflicting her injuries, at least not visible ones. Lilith was astonished, but Fire Sorrow was not. This was because in the entire faction, Lucia was second only to Lucifer. Even Fire Sorrow admitted to not being able to beat her in a normal one-on-one battle. Not many minutes later, Valiant, wearing thick plate armor with two oversized swords on either side of her waist, stepped into the hall with heavy dinosaur-like steps. "Looks like there are still a few missing," she commented as she took a seat and gave a nod with a stoic expression on her face. Her voice had barely fallen when several 6th Order stalks entered the room and after respectfully greeting those already present stood on either side of the table keeping order. As Crow arrived in the meeting room with a slight smile on his handsome face, he nodded to all the ladies present before focusing on Lilith. His eyes couldn't help but light up as he took seat, but he didn't say anything and just limited himself to appreciating her overwhelming beauty and charm. As for Lilith, she paid no attention to him, nor was she bothered by his eyes. To her, Crow's eyes were no different than any other man's eyes, and she could care less about his thoughts or feelings. Just then, and as if it had been timed, Lucifer growled softly but clear to everyone in the silent room. Slowly and with lazy movements, he straightened his body and stretched his arms skyward, making the bones in his body thunder as if he had just slept 2 or 3 days at a stretch. He looked around at everyone present, focusing more on those seated at the table, and immediately noticed an empty space. "Everyone, good morning. I hope you've had a good life so far." Lucifer nodded with sleepy eyes, before turning to look at Fire Sorrow. "What about Hellscar? I'm afraid I don't know." Fire Sorrow looked at the empty seat and said somewhat worriedly, "Although Hellscar is a bit loud and not very smart, he was always quite punctual, often even arriving at meetings before everyone else. Well, let's wait for him a little longer." Lucifer nodded calmly before looking at Lilith steadily. "Is something wrong, Your Majesty?" Lilith asked calmly after being watched for a few seconds. Sorry." Lucifer looked her in the eyes this time, making Lilith realize that he wasn't looking at her. At least not exactly her body itself. "Bloody succubus, I like your new earring." "That's an item attached to a legend-grade treasure, isn't it?" Lucifer suddenly pointed out. It was then that everyone noticed an extra accessory on Lilith's body. The earring was long due to the sapphire-colored feather with a faint sky-colored glow around it, reaching about halfway up Lilith's neck. The body of the earring was completely golden with silver-colored runes that, besides empowering it, certainly added even more charm to the object. "That's right. Your Majesty has quite good eyes." Lilith nodded without pretension. Lucifer nodded and continued, "Did you get a good blacksmith? What about the rune encryptor? If you want, I can ask Sammy and Tommy to make a new earring for you using that legend-grade feather." "That's not necessary." Involuntarily, Lilith's face turned slightly frosty and her tone of voice became slightly aggressive as she rejected Lucifer's offer without even thinking about it or processing what he had said. This earring was an anniversary gift that Xietain had given her, and one that he had worked like crazy for a long time to forge, not only investing time and effort but also using all the best materials he had to give her, the best. Even if someone offered her 20 legend-grade treasures in return, Lilith would still prefer the earring he had gifted her. To her, this was a priceless gift, and she certainly wouldn't let anyone even touch it, not to mention modify or destroy it. "I see. If you say so, then forget it." Lucifer nodded after a brief silence and didn't press the matter any further. "Lilith, just now you went a little mad, didn't you?" Fire Sorrow smiled and said in a joking tone, "Somehow you remind me of the ladies in romance novels I used to read in the past. When they protect something, their loved ones give them on special days." Lilith's expression didn't change, but her eyes moved to Fire Sorrow upon hearing her words, and when Fire Sorrow saw the surprise in Lilith's gaze, she opened her eyes wide. This time it was her turn to be surprised. "For real?" Chapter 982 Peculiarity of the Abyssal Rift, Part 3. Lilith immediately noticed that everyone in the room was staring at her, but she didn't care. Despite knowing that her words might cause some commotion, there was nothing to negate, as there was nothing to be ashamed of, and it wasn't as if she owed anything to anyone present. Therefore, Lilith shrugged as she looked at Fire Sorrow and said casually, "Who knows? Maybe." Although she hadn't said it openly to avoid future trouble, not for herself but mostly for Xietain, the fact that she didn't deny it certainly meant something. Lilith was loved by many men, so many that they could not be counted. There was also no shortage of females who had fallen victim to her charm and natural beauty. One could only try to imagine the kind of expression everyone in the room put on when, instead of hearing a negative response from her, what they received in return was a shrug of shoulders and a response that was unclear, but somehow left wide open the possibility that the heart of one of the two most beautiful women in the entire universe had already been taken by someone. Even Lucifer's presence could not hold back the increasingly outrageous mutterings of the Sixth Order demons, standing on either side of the table. "Lilith, you're joking, aren't you?" Crow looked at her with a fairly dark expression on his face, and it was clear to everyone that he was trying his best to contain his temper. Joking? Lilith gave him a sidelong glance and said with her usual indifference, "Did you or anyone in this room ever hear a joke from me? Before Crow gets violent, we better get this meeting started. It's important." Lucifer sighed. He looked at Crow and then at Lilith as he calmly said, "The bloody succubus partner could be anyone, and we'll never know if she doesn't want to say. Who knows, it could even be a lower existence, and we'll never know. She's under no obligation to tell us if she's in a relationship or not after all." Naturally, when everyone heard Lucifer's words, they took it as a joke on his part in an attempt to lighten the mood a bit, as certainly no leader wanted to see their generals getting into an argument. In fact, even Crow relaxed his expression a bit at the mention of lower existences. He thought Lucifer had said those two words with disdainful intentions, as if to point out that probably there was no one, and Lilith probably just wasn't compelled to respond with a yes or no answer. Only Lilith herself felt that something was not right when Lucifer mentioned the possibility of her being in a romantic relationship with a lower existence, and frowned tightly in her heart. Unfortunately, it was hard to know what Lucifer was thinking, even though many saw him as a fool. Therefore, no matter how much she stared at him, she didn't figure out anything at all. So Lucifer looked at the surroundings and said in a low but clear to everyone voice, "Does anyone know where the hell's car is?" They all frowned and looked at each other, shaking their heads at each other's eyes to signal that they had no idea. It was at that moment that Fire Sorrow suddenly thought of something, and her bewitching eyes widened. "Why, Your Majesty." "What is it?" Lucifer looked at her with boredom. Fire Sorrow took a deep breath to calm herself, and after a moment asked, trying to keep her composure, "I'm sure you already did, but, just in case. Your Majesty released Hellscar from the confined space you put him in about 9 or 10 months ago, didn't you? Hellscar was locked up?" Crow raised an eyebrow at the news. That ape probably did something stupid again." Valiant snorted without too much surprise on her face. Regardless of the murmurs, Lucifer and Fire Sorrow just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. "You don't tell me Hellscar still?" Fire Sorrow gulped audibly as she stared at him in utter disbelief. Even though she hadn't finished her words, it was obvious what she meant. I did get him out of prison, of course." Lucifer nodded with a serious expression and pointed to the side of the room. "Look, there he is." As Fire Sorrow turned to look at the seemingly lifeless giant man with his eyes rolled back and dried tears on his face lying on the ground on his back, she couldn't help but turn quickly to face Lucifer. "You think none of us felt when you activated your magic?" Lucifer looked away as if he dared not look her in the eyes, and said in a low voice, "Bring forth the evidence of the crime or make the victim talk. It's the law." "Nonsense with your law." The corner of everyone's mouth trembled fiercely as they looked at their leader and highest general discussing, but not arguing. Lilith secretly shook her head, and even for her it was difficult to keep her expression indifferent against the scene in front of her. After Hellscar woke up from his nightmare, and when he saw the daylight again, he immediately burst into tears like a little child. He even ran to Lucifer apologizing, while throwing glances filled with hidden bitterness at Fire Sorrow, clearly blaming her for sending him as a messenger and putting him in such an ugly situation. This made Fire Sorrow not know whether to laugh or cry. How was she to blame for the one who led them being so irresponsible in certain matters? 30 minutes later, Lucifer looked at everyone one by one, and then did something that made the expression on everyone's face undergo drastic changes. What seemed to be black flames covered his body for an instant, and when those black flames disappeared, his silk pajamas were nowhere to be seen. When they saw the light plate armor shining like gold on the body of the one who led them, all the members of the demonic army present realized that this meeting was not only not a casual one, but could no longer even be classified as something serious, as the word serious would be a great understatement. All laziness disappeared from Lucifer's eyes, and for the first time in a long time, Lilith felt like she was looking at a colossal mountain standing before her. "War?" Lucia asked in a monotone voice. Among those present, only Lucia and Fire Sorrow dared to speak directly to Lucifer when he went into serious mode. This was because he didn't like wasting his time, and everyone who wasted his time didn't end well. That's right. Lucifer nodded, his voice was deep as he gave his younger sister a sidelong glance. But it's not against any faction, you might be thinking, Lucia. Don't tell me. She muttered, and for the first time since Lilith had known her, she saw Lucia's ever-emotionless expression showing shock. Lucifer pulled a round, flat disc-like device from his storage ring and tossed it into the center of the table. He injected his mana, and the soul stone embedded in the center glowed, causing the device to float a few inches above the table and release a strange energy that soon became a sort of 3D oval, and seconds later everyone could see the image of a certain part of the universe. Everything was black except for the white, silver, blue, red, and yellow glows of what appeared to be countless distant stars. However, what caught the attention of everyone was the huge blood-red crack right in the center of the image. Beyond the crack, there were no stars, there was nothing but red. It was as if that was the limit of the universe. Impossible. Fire Sorrow stood up with wide eyes. She ignored the shocked looks from those who had never seen her lose her self-control in such a way, and as she stared at the image she remarked, How can it have expanded so much? We should still have at least 10 years left before the abyssal rift expanded enough to allow an army from the other side to invade. Crimson crack, abyssal rift, end of the cosmos, gate of the end, etc. That great blood-red mouth was known by all the higher existences, and over the years it had been given many different names. When a living being entered one of the 8 existing factions, the first thing the newcomer was told about, apart from the rules of each faction, was exactly about the abyssal rift. The abyssal rift, a door to an unknown place that no one could pass through but from which terrifying enemies could emerge to invade. Protecting that place and not allowing invaders who were not attached to the rules of the soul record to immerse themselves through the universe and wipe out the lives of countless lower existences was the task of all the factions of higher existences. As we all already know, the last ones to defend were the white pigeons. Lucifer said in a cold voice as he stared at the huge rift that seemed to split the universe in two. This happened 990 years ago, so in theory, we should have another 10 years since the abyssal rift used to open once every 1,000 years at least. And I say used to because as you can see that peculiarity or characteristic disappeared a week ago. In a nutshell, Lucifer looked at everyone present, especially those who had the qualifications to sit at the table next to him, and said in a deep voice, "We are being invaded, again." Chapter 983 Anti-Magic Domain. Back to the present, planet Earth. By Zemin's group submerged into the deep waters of the East Sea and under the guidance of Xietain moved, with a clear goal in mind. It really feels a bit scary. Wu Yijun commented as she looked at her surroundings warily. The masks that Xietain had given them earlier were primarily intended to allow the wearer to breathe underwater, but being a mask without holes, it also allowed the wearer to open their mouth and speak without having to worry about filling their lungs with water. Most sea creatures in this area obey me after my third brother took his soldiers with him when he ran away from the previous war. Xietain pointed out. She and the 2 Triton bodyguards were the only 3 who could see with absolute clarity amidst so much darkness. After all, the 3 of them were sea creatures to begin with. Therefore, you guys don't need to worry too much. Keeping your guard up is good though. She finished and accelerated her swimming speed a bit, wagging her mermaid tail temptingly and with surprising agility. Shangguan Bing Shui had created small spheres of transparent ice, and inside them, she had placed many luminescent seeds that Wu Yijun had given her. These seeds had no function other than to illuminate, but even then they were considered as quite precious items as they were not like any other seeds. These seeds were rank 2 objects that Wu Yijun had carefully nurtured, and each of them had enough power to illuminate at the same power as a military-grade handheld spotlight. Thanks to the fact that each ice sphere had more than 20 seeds, even after diving more than 600 meters, the group of 10 could still see relatively well. In addition, the fact that they were all powerful soul evolvers certainly helped more than one might think. The group swam for more than 5 hours in a straight line, moving a great distance away from the shore and deep into waters that no longer belonged to a part of the East. See that cut part of China in 2 halves. It was only after swimming for about 300 kilometers that Xietain began to lead everyone down into the sea. A few minutes later, we've only submerged for a little over 1,500 meters, but the water pressure is really something. Shangguan Xingyue commented. A normal second-order soul evolver would probably not be able to handle the gravity of the world along with the water pressure at this level. Their bodies would definitely explode into pieces. Evangeline added. Everyone except Xietain and her 2 Triton bodyguards was experiencing a severe drop in their overall movement capability and agility. Bai Zemin looked at Kong Jun a little worried, as it was no secret to anyone that ants were not good swimmers. Fortunately, the big former bodyguard of the former queen of the Weaver ants seemed to be doing just fine on his own. If Kong Jun had any problems, then Bai Zemin would find it necessary to order everyone to return to the surface. After all, and to a certain extent, Kong Jun was even more important than Bai Zemin in the fight to come. After a few minutes, and realizing that they were still descending, Meng Qi could not help but say in astonishment, "We are still going deeper. This must be at least 3,000 meters deep." Don't forget that the world not only grew in length and width through evolution, but also expanded in terms of depth and height. Bai Zemin remarked. "Are right." Bai Zemin smiled slightly under his mask and was about to say something when he noticed a point of light in the distance, at least a couple thousand meters deeper. "We're close." Xietain exclaimed in ecstasy. All the humans in the group were a bit excited and curious to visit the sea city. This was because, as far as was widely known to the public, things like cities at the bottom of the sea had never existed. Besides, the sea race seemed to be stupidly developed, which was certainly strange. Therefore, one of the goals that Bai Zemin and the rest had in mind was to try to learn something and get information about it. Although all of them had already accepted that Earth hid many secrets and was certainly not a normal world after finding ancient ruins with technology and artifacts that surpassed the era they lived in, they still had to find answers, or at least a path to lead them to those answers. Why were there soul evolvers from ancient times? Wasn't the soul record supposed to have visited this world for the first time a little over a year ago? How was it possible for the sea race to have so many good things, and even cities under the sea? What had happened to make all the soul evolvers of the past disappear? If the soul record had been on Earth before, why had it left only to return who knows how many years later? There were too many unknowns, but no answers. And not knowing the world they were walking on was certainly not a good feeling for them, who needed not only strength, but also information in order not to be caught with their pants down, something that could end up causing their death. Just when Bai Zemin was immersed in his own thoughts and thinking that they were already safe, his passive skill danger sense suddenly triggered and brought him out of his dream world. All the hairs on his body stood on end like a cat facing a great threat, and before his brain processed what was happening, his body suddenly moved on its own, thanks to the countless battles to the death against stronger enemies he had experienced until today. Gravity manipulation x60. Instinctively knowing that he had no time to raise a blood wall, Bai Zemin increased the pressure of the world in front of him to the maximum possible. At the same time as all the water in the sea several kilometers around moved and began to gather in front of Bai Zemin's group, thus forming a large vortex spinning at terrifying speeds. Shangguan Bing Shui's voice, followed by the freezing of a large portion of the sea in front of them, reached everyone's ears as she activated Ice Maker. Ice Shield. The already high power of Ice Maker became even more terrifying in the seas, and at the same time that the skill gravity manipulation showed a completely different effect than what Bai Zemin was used to seeing on land, the enemy's magical attack finally clashed with the two allied skills. Boom! An explosion whose sound was considerably suppressed by the endless sea surrounding them sent Meng Qi, Xietain, and the two female Tritons flying backward. All four spat out a bit of blood and had difficulty stabilizing themselves as they struggled against the underwater waves that whipped their bodies unrestrainedly. Evangeline could not be seen anywhere, so it was hard to tell what her current situation was, but the surprising thing was that even under the sea and with water all around her, there was still no trace of her existence. Shangguan Xingyue was a little better, and although she was also sent flying backwards, she was not injured. Shangguan Bingshui and Bai Zemin both grunted slightly, especially he as had made a move to cover her with his body to avoid Shangguan Bingshui taking the worst of the inevitable. Fortunately, although the ice shield and the large water whirlwind were shattered by the enemy's magical attack, both defenses were enough to avoid the worst, and only the remaining magic aftershocks hit their bodies. Ijuan, Bai Zemin called while keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead. Wu Ijuan gritted her teeth and quickly activated her skill hydrokinesis, even though she had not yet managed to stabilize her body amidst the swaying sea. Hydrokinesis, being a skill that was somewhere in between maker and manipulation and which had some of the power of both but consumed more of the user's mana, allowed Wu Ijuan to control the water around her to some extent, and, although it was difficult, she managed to shape giant water hands that held the bodies of Meng Qi, Xian Meier, and the two tritons that had taken a bad part of the previous explosion. Rumble. The sea was still shaking, but the waters had calmed down enough for everyone to stand firm in their places. It was then that Bai Zemin's group saw two silhouettes that had stopped about 500 meters ahead and were currently staring at them. Tao Ji looked at the young man who had given him so many problems in the battle half a month ago, and an expression of confusion shone on his face as he studied him intently. Bai Zemin and the others were doing exactly the same thing, studying the enemy in front of them. Just as Bai Zemin expected, Tao Ji had not yet fully recovered from the previous battle, but he was not too far away either. Most notable was the fact that Tao Ji's left arm was nowhere to be seen, proof that the hit he had received from the cosmic particle cannon had certainly been fatal. However, this did not mean that the battle was won before the start. In fact, it was the opposite. Things couldn't get any worse. Shangguan Bingshui whispered low enough for only Bai Zemin, who was standing next to her, to hear her words. It's not like we didn't get prepared in advance for this. Bai Zemin did not deny Shangguan Bingshui's words, as she was right, but he did not despair either. With a quick glance, Bai Zemin set his eyes on third Prince Xian Kuan, who was standing about 200 or 300 meters behind Tao Ji. We will continue with our plan. Bai Zemin motioned for Shangguan Bingshui to step back, and she quickly stomped an ice platform to propel herself backwards. With her backing off, Kong Jun, who had not even flinched at the earlier explosion, moved forward and stood next to Bai Zemin. If that weaver ant standing next to you had been in our battle half a month ago, there is a chance that even I might not have been able to escape alive, Tao Ji admitted as he looked at Kong Jun with a hint of wariness. A moment later, his eyes fell on Bai Zemin again, and he said in a cold voice, "But the courage you have become at least 50% or even weaker compared to you from 2 weeks ago. Although I have not yet fully recovered, in the water, I am the king, while you, land creatures, have no way of not losing strength in general." What Tao Ji was saying was true, completely true. Being a pure mage, his magical abilities would lose practically no power underwater, and since he was an alligator, he would certainly receive a boost on his agility now that he was in his territory. Meanwhile, the agility of Bai Zemin and the others had declined from the moment they entered the sea, and there were some skills that could no longer be used, while others would show completely different effects. However, don't worry, I believe we won't let you down, Bai Zemin replied in an indifferent voice. The active effect of the skill, soul manipulation, had a cooldown time of 60 days, so considering the fact that Bai Zemin had used the skill exactly 17 days ago, there was no way he would be able to use it immediately. At least not in normal times. At least not until before he obtained his king subclass after conquering the entirety of China. At least not until before he got the skill Mankind's Pioneer. Mankind's Pioneer, third order active skill, level 3. A skill given only to those who pave the path for their respective race in their respective world. Only those who achieve a great accomplishment, being the first in a task on a massive scale, considered to be incredibly challenging, are worthy of possessing it. First activation, Human Protector. When fighting non-human beings, the user can choose between 5 normal skills, 3 unique skills, or 1 EX skill and reset its cooldown to 0 seconds. It can only be used one time every 15 days. Second activation. Xietain looked at Tao Xi indifferently as he started up the first activation of the skill Mankind's Pioneer, and with a single thought from him, soul manipulation immediately turned activatable. It's true that my current self is way weaker than the time we fought. Xietain nodded and activated soul manipulation. Tao Xi didn't dare to be careless and observed all the enemies in front of him earnestly. Last time a little carelessness had cost him a lot after attacking right away. This time he wanted to make sure first, instead of thinking that his strength was enough to end it all. After all, he had made his preparations and only needed caution for this battle to end in his victory. Although the enemy's caution was certainly a problem for Xietain and his team, in some ways it was also an advantage. But, haven't you become weaker too? Weaker? I have. Tao Xi frowned and his mouth opened, revealing 2 rows of extremely sharp teeth. Let me show you how wrong you are. Saying that, Tao Xi pointed his magic staff to the front and a huge golden-colored magic circle illuminated the area. Bright water spear. Swoosh. A spear over 50 meters long shot out like lightning from the magic circle, and from the way the sea began to rumble it was clear to everyone that Tao Xi's magic power was certainly not at all lower than his magic power of half a month ago, even though he was not yet fully recovered. Xietain sensed mortal danger, but instead of dodging, he simply muttered under his breath words that the universe had not heard for several million years. Anti-Magic Domain. Chapter 984, The Power of the Legendary Anti-Magic Domain. When Tao Xi's magic skill shot out towards Xietain, the powerful Fourth Order alligator thought that what he would be seeing would be an outcome at least somewhat similar to the one before, when the entire enemy group went into chaos, with some of them getting injured. However, what happened next caused his eyes to gradually widen and his reptilian pupils to shrink fiercely. With Xietain as its center, a globe of strange energy invisible to the naked eye shot outward until it reached a maximum of 100 meters. When the tip of the magic spear, the skill Bright Water Spear cast by Tao Xi a second ago, touched the edge of that invisible energy bubble, the spear exploded like an egg hitting a wall, and bright particles of mana illuminated by magic power shone on the bottom of the once again agitated sea. A very soft, but somehow clear sound of confusion and bewilderment came out of Tao Xi's half-open mouth as he stared at Xietain in shock. What the hell had just happened? Poison water swords. Tao Xi muttered with his eyes still wide open as he pointed his magic staff forward. Swoosh. From a magic circle 10 meters in diameter, a strange energy that turned a small part of the water into deep purple swords covered a part of the sea in front of Tao Xi, and an instant later there were over 100 poisonous water swords that shot towards Xietain and Kong Jun that were at the front of the group. Xietain took out annihilation of the falling sky in the form of a golden whip and waited standing in the water, with an indifferent expression. After the enemy's magic swords began to break into the 100-meter area around him, the domain power that was once used by the legendary barbarian king millions of years ago and terrified all the mages in the universe went into effect. Bang! 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 Bang, 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 bang. For each explosion of each poisonous water sword formed from the magic cast by Tao Xi, Xietain received a green-lettered message in his retinas. Effect Anti-Magic has been successfully triggered and you have nullified an enemy magic skill. Anti-Magic effect has been successfully triggered and you have nullified an enemy magic skill. Anti-Magic effect has been successfully triggered. Anti-magic effect has been successfully triggered. However, not all of the poisonous water swords were nullified when they came into contact with the invisible energy bubble around him. Swoosh. 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 Approximately half of the poison water swords managed to pierce past the invisible energy bubble and continued on their way to Xietain and Kong Jun. However, even though about 50% of the poison water swords managed to penetrate the anti-magic domain, the magic power contained in each sword fell and their sizes were abruptly halved. Although Xietan's attack speed had dropped tremendously because of the pressure of the sea on his body, hitting 100 times in 1 second was still something within his range. He swung Annihilation of the Falling Sky, triggering terrifying water explosions once he activated Overlap Regeneration and using 90% of his stamina to boost his strength and agility tremendously, bringing his strength stat a bit below the level he had when he was under the effect of 2 triggers of the skill Blood Berserker's Wrath without the use of Overlap Regeneration. Despite having less than half the strength compared to his previous battle against Tao Ji, it was more than enough to briefly create water drains in the sea, and every time the golden whip hit a poison water sword, it was immediately shattered. Not even 2 seconds had passed, but under Tao Ji's now wide-open eyes, another of his magical skills had been completely nullified, and the scariest thing of all was that the enemy had not even suffered a scratch. Xietain retracted his whip and with a single thought made Annihilation of the Falling Sky turn into a two-handed heavy sword. His eyes looked at Tao Ji with indifference as he calmly said, "Everyone, remember that each of us has a task to do." Without waiting for a reply, he kicked the step of water under his feet that had formed in the same way that the steps of air he used to move through the sky formed, and with the speed of a torpedo dashed toward his enemy. Without giving him time to think about what was happening, Kong Jun did not stand idly by either, as with a loud explosion that formed an air bubble of over 50 meters. Around him he exploded with great speed, even surpassing Xietain in terms of starting acceleration. "You stay back." Theo Ji barked behind in a deep voice before waving his right hand outward. Around 200 large golden magic circles appeared on the bottom of the sea, illuminating the entire area immediately, as his magic power burst outwards. Electric Viper. From inside the magic circles, what appeared to be at least 400 golden mutant snakes, with flashes of golden lightning crackling around their bodies whose length reached 100 meters, rushed out towards Xietain and Kong Jun. However, the approximately 400 electric snakes had barely left the golden magic circles when their movement speed plummeted. Not only the electric snakes, but even Tao Ji, who was moving to stay away from his enemies so that he could exploit his power as a mage, had a great change in his expression. When looking at his body, he noticed a faint layer of ice covering his limbs, and even the entire sea area showed signs of frostbite. Out of the corner of his eye, Tao Ji managed to make out Shangguan Bing Shui standing more than 500 meters away, with her right hand pointing outward, and from her palm, there was a large amount of frost-like energy constantly being released. Unfortunately, despite knowing who the culprit behind the abrupt drop in his agility was, Tao Ji had bigger problems to deal with. Xietain and Kong Jun advanced side by side, and when the electric snakes came into contact with the invisible energy bubble surrounding the two with Xietain as its center, they all suffered one of two fates. Some simply exploded and golden particles floated in the sea for a brief moment before disappearing. The rest had their size halved after coming into contact with the invisible energy, and all of those that charged towards Xietain were shattered when he hit the weak points of the magic that shaped them with his great sword. As for Kong Jun, he was a lot straighter. Boom. 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 His body was struck by at least 100 electric snakes, and his figure disappeared amidst millions of giant bubbles that covered even Xietain, and 500 meters of the sea around them churned fiercely. Swoosh. Swoosh. Tao Ji had no time to relax as two silhouettes shot out from within the countless bubbles caused by the previous explosions, swooshing towards him with determination. A strange midnight black exoskeleton armor was now covering Kong Jun's body, barely exposing part of the mask that allowed him to breathe being where his eyes were. There was no damage on him and his speed was not reduced either. Thanks to the invisible energy surrounding Bai Zemin and thus Kong Jun, the frost released by Shangguan Bing Shui did not affect them practically at all, as her magic was directly destroyed by the domain. Bai Zemin did not dare to use crimson flame, let alone endless blue lotus flame on the bottom of the sea, as it might cause a terrifying explosion from which no one would come out unscathed. Therefore, he raised his greatsword above his head and with an ice-cold expression swung downward as if he wanted to break his enemy's head in two. Boom! The sea shook, and for a brief moment, there was a vacuum bubble in which all water was expelled as a result of the powerful explosion. However, although Tao Ji's expression was not at all agreeable, he did not receive the slightest damage, as between him and Bai Zemin was a glowing emerald green barrier that shuddered after receiving the blow from the golden greatsword head-on but did not even crack a little. This was one of the drawbacks of the anti-magic domain, or rather, it was a drawback that Bai Zemin had to accept since his order of power limited him greatly. Anti-magic domain, 7th order passive/active skill, level 5. Using the universal law of physical force releases the power of said law, covering a sphere where all magic will suffer the power of the physical force of the universe. The range of the anti-magic sphere depends on the user's strength stat. Nullifies with a 100% chance all magic activated by enemies that are in the same order as the user within the anti-magic domain or that come in contact with the sphere formed by the universal law of physical force. Nullifies with a 100% chance all attack, defense, and restrictive type magic of enemies that are one order above the user. Nullifies with a 75% chance all attack and restrictive type magic of enemies that are two orders above the user. Nullifies with a 50% chance all attack type magic of enemies that are three orders above the user. All magic capable of penetrating beyond the universal law of physical force will be affected, experiencing a 50% drop in power with a maximum of up to 4 orders above the user. The user can use their eyes to see the weak points of attack-type magic launched by the enemy, thus allowing them to shatter it almost at will each time said magic comes into contact with the anti-magic sphere. It consumes 900 stamina points to activate and 20 stamina points per second to sustain it active. The skill has a cooldown time of 24 hours, but can be kept active indefinitely as long as the user's stamina is high enough to support the drain. It was true that the power of the anti-magic domain was somehow not what Bai Zemin expected, but this did not mean that he was disappointed, and in fact, he accepted it in his heart. In fact, it would have been even odder if Bai Zemin, being a first-order soul evolver, was able to simply nullify all magic at will. Such a thing was simply absurd. The reason why the Barbarian King's anti-magic domain was feared in the past was because the Barbarian King himself was an 8th order soul evolver, and thanks to his high soul league there was no magic capable of breaking his domain, but Bai Zemin was yet in the first order. Even limited by his order, the power of the domain that in the past could only be used by the Barbarian King who, in his time of life, possessed terrifying physical strength and was unable to use mana made Bai Zemin feel terrified of having to face an enemy with such skill. Certainly, the disbelief and fear that Bai Zemin saw in Tao Ji's eyes as he unsuccessfully tried to break through the magical barrier was proof of this factor. World Breaker. Hearing a somewhat robotic and emotionless voice, Tao Ji's pupils trembled fiercely when he saw the ant from before appearing right in front of him with the defensive barrier as the only separation. Rumble. A blood-red light covered Kong Jun's right fist, and with a speed that simply left a crimson flash on the bottom of the sea, he punched without holding back at all. Boom! A huge sphere of vacuum opened outward with Kong Jun's fist and the place he had struck as its center, blowing out all the water with such force that sizable waves rose to the surface despite the fact that they were currently fighting more than 3,000 meters below sea level. Wu Yijun made use of her skill hydrokinesis to prevent the turbulent waters from affecting her team without worrying about the high mana consumption, as she knew this was a battle destined to be over in minutes at the most. Xian Meier and Meng Qi looked at each other for a second before nodding back in between. The two women shot forward at full speed with their eyes fixed on third Prince Xian Kuan, who watched everything from a distance. Shangguan Binxue continued to expend her mana to partially freeze part of the sea, and although she could not control the parts she wanted to affect since she did not have ice manipulation, what she could do was focus more on some parts to affect the enemies more and less to her allies in comparison. Shangguan Xingyue stood beside her daughter acting as a bodyguard, and Evangeline was simply nowhere to be seen. Ugh. Tao Ji's expression wrinkled tightly as his magic barrier was covered in cracks after being smashed by the mutant ant's fierce punch. He knew that weaver ants were a terrifying species, but the ant in front of him was on a completely different level, to the point where he couldn't help but wonder if he would really be able to beat him in a 1 versus 1 even at his peak. Fortunately, Tao Ji had made enough preparations this time. He refused to believe that the kids before him could possibly stop him. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 985. The situation worsens. Kong Jun was indeed powerful. Although he had not yet become a fourth-order existence, even though it had been more than 9 months since he joined by Zeman's group, this was just another proof of how difficult his evolution requirements were, which in return hinted at how powerful his fourth-order class would be once he successfully advanced. Yet, despite not being a fourth-order soul evolver, Kong Yung was at level 200, right on the borderline between the two stages of power. Bai Zemin was not so sure how high Kong Jun's strength was, but after some careful estimation and analysis he guessed that Kong Jun's strength stat was probably somewhere in the 7,000 or 8,000 point range, even higher than Bai Zemin's strength at his highest state reached to date. At the end of the day, besides having absorbed many powerful enemy records and being a level 200 soul evolver, Kong Jun was a weaver ant that by essence were physically more powerful than most creatures after evolving. However, Tao Ji was certainly a monster that had lived for a long time and with countless years of experience, as well as powerful skills in his arsenal. Magic drawl. Tao Ji's voice had barely fallen when, to everyone's shock, the surrounding water began to tremble and, subsequently, shimmer. In less than a second, at least 40,000 square meters of seawater disappeared, leaving a large emptiness that, with a powerful explosion, soon began to be filled by more water coming from everywhere. At the same time as the emerald green barrier shone again with great brilliance, the cracks caused by Kong Jun's punch on the barrier weakened by Bai Zemin's attack on the weak point of the defense began to disappear, and in less than a second, the barrier was back to its maximum. It was around that time when Tao Ji sighed in relief as he looked back and noticed that Xian Kuan did not seem to be having much trouble fighting the two females that had rushed towards him. However, Tao Ji's relief was only there because he did not know that Xian Meier was a genius several times higher than the third prince. Xian Meier was more than enough to kill Xian Kuan if given enough time. However, she did not focus on killing him and in fact did not even attack but used all her skills purely to restrain him. Xian Kuan was an experienced melee warrior, but even though he somehow managed to defend himself and even destroy his little sister's flood dragons, he didn't have time to divert his eyes to the other human female who was about 200 meters distance away. Still, he was mindful of the 4 objects that the human female had let fall around him, but after several seconds and sensing no movement, as well as the constant pestering of his younger sister, Xian Kuan had no choice but to ignore certain seemingly insignificant things. Meng Qi had her eyes closed and was currently making some seals with her hands. However, her movements were extremely slow, and beneath her mask, there was a big frown on her face. About a minute later, the first of the 4 discs that Callie had been working on for days, drawing powerful runes, glowed. Meng Qi did not stop but kept going, and if one were to look carefully one would be able to see how the seals she formed with her mana-covered hands were actually drawings of runes, and once those drawings were completed one of the runes on one of the discs would light up. Meanwhile, the battle between Bai Zemin and the rest against Tao Ji raged on. The explosions under the sea became more and more terrifying, and even though the battle was taking place at a depth of over 3,000 meters below the surface, a cataclysm was being unleashed as waves up to over 200 meters high rose into the sky before crashing down after hitting each other. Boom! Tao Ji flew backwards like a torpedo as under the perfect allied combination of Bai Zemin and Kong Jun his defensive barrier was broken, and was only after about 60 meters that he managed to stabilize his body. His eyes were cold as he looked at his enemies and watched as a thin trickle of dark blue blood flowed out of his mouth and floated in front of him before being diluted in the seawater. Approximately 2 minutes had passed, and during those 2 minutes, the advantage kept tilting to the side of Bai Zemin and his team. Shangguan Bing Shui held back using her powerful crowd control skills. Bai Zemin weakened and protected using mainly the power of his anti-magic domain along with the different forms of annihilation of the falling sky. Kong Jun attacked simply and directly but effectively with his fists. It could be said that the three of them together were the perfect combination. A triangle of impenetrable power to the point where even Tao Ji could do nothing but retreat despite having many powerful magic skills and having higher stats in general. However, although Bai Zemin's expression showed no emotions, only he and those who knew what his plan was knew how anxious he was, as did the entire team, naturally. If Evangeline was unlucky, then the whole team could only give their all to kill Tao Ji using whatever it took. It was entirely in her hands as to whether Bai Zemin managed to evolve to second order in the midst of the battle. With his armor covered with small holes and some wounds which were no longer bleeding thanks to the power of blood manipulation, Bai Zemin looked at Xian Kuan and felt a little better when he saw that 3 of the 4 discs were already on. It was right at that moment when Tao Ji opened his mouth filled with terrifying teeth and spoke in a hoarse and cold voice. My name is Tao Ji. I used to be the leader of the Mage Legion of the Atlantis Kingdom and ranked only below the Forgotten King in terms of pure power. I have lived over 7,600 years regardless, only the sea god knows how long I slept in the immortal ice coffin, and I do admit that you are the most formidable team I have ever known. Even though Bai Zemin and the rest finally knew the name of the alligator they were facing for the second time, in what was undoubtedly the most difficult battle they had all had in their lives, even though they finally confirmed the fact that they were fighting a creature so ancient that even surpassed the oldest history they knew, none of them felt satisfaction, let alone pride, at being commended. Quite the contrary, they all felt that something bad was about to come. But even Bai Zemin with danger sense felt nothing, so they could only continue to move forward cautiously. Even if he hadn't used soul manipulation to raise danger sense for 1 order this time, the skill hadn't stopped working. My current level is 256, and the fact that you 3 can take me on and even show to be able to defeat me is certainly commendable. Tao Ji slowly straightened his body, and with a chillingly indifferent expression said in a deep voice, but all strategy or numerical advantage means nothing in the face of absolute power. This is the universal rule that no one can challenge. He pointed his magic staff upward and said with some pride, fire. Bai Zemin's eyebrows furrowed deeply, but before he had to wonder what was about to happen he saw how from the distant white point of light that was, where the city of the realm where Xian Mayer came from, a red dot flashed, and for an instant, it consumed the white light. There was no alert from the skill danger sense, which meant that Bai Zemin was not in danger. However, this meant that one of his allies was. Unfortunately, there were many things that were faster than sound or reaction speed. All Bai Zemin saw was a flash of crimson light, and he barely had time to look out of the corner of his eye just in time to see Kong Jun crossing his arms in front of his chest, probably out of instinct, before his body was hit full on by a bright, thick beam of blood-red light. Kong Jun. Bai Zemin called out when he saw Bai Shirling's silent but loyal bodyguard being sent flying backwards by the red-colored beam. Blackish-colored blood stained a small part of the area, but soon it faded away under the power of the blood-red beam, and although Kong Jun had not yet died as Bai Zemin had not been notified about the loss of a loyal follower, he certainly would not survive even 3 seconds in the face of such a dreadful power as the one emanating from the beam. Fortunately, the blood-red beam disappeared abruptly, and although Kong Jun had been sent flying to an unknown part of the sea and was probably no longer able to fight, the good news was that he was still alive. Actually, that's one of the secondary cannons. Tao Ji's voice sounded fairly arrogant, drawing everyone's attention once again. The energy consumption is too huge, so there's no need to waste it on someone who is more than half dead. I'll finish off the weaver and myself after I'm done with you all. Tao Ji, I will definitely rip your head off with my bare hands. Bai Zemin roared furiously. Even if Kong Jun was not particularly close to him, it was true that his loyalty was unquestionable and he certainly cared a lot about little Bai Sherlin to the point where she even called him uncle. He knew that Kong Jun would not survive more than 1 hour at the most because the power of that blood-red beam from before was simply frightening to the point of being comparable to the Sky Destroyer's main cannon. Even if Kong Jun's defense was high, he certainly couldn't take a shot like that head-on and walk away without any problems, even though he only took damage for 1 to 2 seconds at most. Considering the place they were in, the distance, there was no way Kong Lan or Xiaya would arrive in time no matter what. Bloodlust has reached its peak. Second activation of God of War's will, God of War's partial possession, goes into immediate effect. Strength 800, Magic 800. Although Tao Ji could sense that Bai Zemin's aura had increased by a substantial degree, the battle was already decided. With the weaver out and the black-haired youth being at least half the power he had been during their battle half a month ago, Tao Ji might not even need to use his secret weapon again. Bing Shui, give me a hand. Bai Zemin called out as he activated overlap regeneration and dashed forward now at a speed several times faster than before. Overlap regeneration was the only reason Bai Zemin could keep fighting, not only because of the raw power it gave him but also because of the fact that it was this activation what allowed him to recover his mana to the fullest. After all, keeping the anti-magic domain active consumed too much stamina that was already being rapidly consumed by fighting at the bottom of the sea. Therefore, he had no choice but to activate regeneration constantly to replenish his stamina every couple of seconds. Shangguan Bing Shui did not hesitate at all upon hearing Bai Zemin. She immediately gave up on using magic as she knew he could not control who his domain affected, and with a swift but elegant movement she unsheathed a beautiful deep blue sword. When the sword was unsheathed, 2 of its special attributes were immediately activated and its magical power tripled while the weapon's physical attack power doubled. The name of this sword was Perfect Storm and it once belonged to a powerful king from Eventide World. Bai Zemin had gifted it to Shangguan Bing Shui not long ago. /N, Chapter 823 for those who want to see Perfect Storm's records. She activated several skills in a flash, increasing her agility, strength, and all her overall defenses in less than a second before turning into a flash of silver light. She held her breath and took off her mask, and as if she knew what Bai Zemin planned to do, she activated the skill that would help him the most to reach his goal while positioning herself at an angle that the enemy definitely couldn't help but stare at. Rumbling the heavens, shaking the earth, at Bai Zemin's roar, annihilation of the falling sky shimmered with a flash of purple light, and the power was enough to cause steady explosions for every inch that the greatsword advanced towards the enemy. Rumble. Tao Ji did not dare to take that attack at all and immediately used his strongest barrier to guard against it. However, just at that instant, his golden eyes subconsciously glanced at the white-haired human female and his movements froze for a brief moment. Not good. Tao Ji's mind immediately began to warn him of the impending danger, and using the active skill of a treasure he broke out of the charm effect he had fallen under. However, it was already too late to defend against Bai Zemin's attack. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse, Chapter 986 White Hole. At the same time as Bai Zemin lashed out with rumbling the heavens, shaking the earth towards Tao Ji, Shangguan Bing Shui activated Divine Speed and Crimson Lightning Flash. She turned into a flash of silver light, disappearing from her position in an instant and moving towards where she trusted Bai Zemin would send the enemy. Boom! Tao Ji's eyes burst open as if they were about to explode, and at the same time as 5 or 6 of his ribs turned to dust, he coughed up blood with fragments of inner organs as he flew backwards with no control of his body. Despite the overwhelming pain, Tao Ji's danger sense skill alerted him, and with wide eyes, He gazed as the human female from before slashed with her sword ferociously towards him. Boom! Shangguan Bing Shui's sword turned into a deep blue flash and with a speed that seemed impossible to follow it, slashed ferociously towards the unprotected Cayman's head. Tao Xi flew to the bottom of the sea with the speed of a torpedo and several scales on his head were sliced into pieces while his brain trembled fiercely. Bing Shui, I know. Neither of them needed to say more, they both knew what they had to do. Shangguan Bing Shui might have lost her crowd control capabilities as a result of the anti-magic domain, but one could not forget that she was a genius soul evolver for both magic use and melee combat. Moreover, with the practically transcendent understanding that Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bing Shui shared on the battlefield, she was undoubtedly the perfect partner for him. To say that the two of them were a perfect duo was not an exaggeration at all. However, neither of them was naive enough to think that the battle was over. Indeed, even though they both hurried at the same time and chased after the enemy, a fluctuation of magic coming from behind caused both of them to turn abruptly just in time to see Tao Xi's body materializing at the same time as a magic circle shimmered on the bottom of the sea and disappeared. The blood coming out of Tao Xi's body was not only not dissolved by the sea water but was actually causing him a lot of problems and dreadful pains under the constant effect of Bai Zemin's skill. Wide-eyed from both the pain and fury he felt, Tao Xi directly spent 2,000 mana points and roared, "Apocalyptic tornado!" At the same time, Meng Qi opened her eyes and shouted joyfully, "Big brother, it's done." Bai Zemin's eyes lit up under his mask as he listened to the third prince's shouts and curses. Arg fuck. What is this thing? Xian Kuan was shocked as his body was chained and sealed by a series of glowing, purple chains. Not only could he not move at all, but every time he tried to break the chains all he achieved was nothing. Xian Mayor, get my sister out of this place. Bai Zemin shouted in an urgent voice. He didn't have time to deal with that because the skill that Tao Xi had activated was troublesome and even the anti-magic domain couldn't completely negate it as this time he was using the seawater to form a large tornado that was advancing towards him and Shangguan Bing Shui. The anti-magic domain could nullify magic but it did not affect the result of being hit by a natural element, like water. Understood. Xian Mayor did not dispute at the fact that she was being ordered. She mounted a flood dragon, and thanks to Meng Qi being understanding she began to quickly ride away with her 2 bodyguards. I'll be waiting for you at the entrance of Royal City. Big brother, you definitely have to come back safely. Meng Qi cried in a voice filled with fear. They had already done their part. There was nothing more they could do here. Staying any longer would only make them nuisances. Seeing the tornado at least 2,000 meters high and no less than 700 meters in diameter moving towards them, Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bing Shui realized that they needed to do something as the rotational force of the tornado was causing their bodies to start moving along with the water directly towards the center of the phenomenon. Raging whirlwind. Wu Yijuan gritted her teeth and activated hydrokinesis again. Her face was pale as although she had not participated in the battle directly, it had been she the one that had controlled the surrounding waters to prevent Bai Zemin and the rest from being affected by the consequences of their attacks under the sea. Under her magic control, a tornado of water began to spin, reaching up to 800 meters in height and just over 300 in diameter. It was simply incomparable to Tao Xi's tornado, but it was understandable given the difference in magical power between the two. Shangguan Xinyue could not make full use of her power underwater as her main skill only allowed her to control one climate in this location. She controlled the low temperatures to freeze some of the enemy tornado's water, weakening its power to some extent. At the same time, she activated Electric World at the center of the tornado launched by Wu Yijuan, strengthening it by adding more magical power and using the purple lightning to whip the enemy's magic. Rumble. The sea rumbled and even the bottom shook as the water and lightning tornado collided head-on with the tornado, about twice its size and whose color was as black as the night itself. Unfortunately, this stalemate did not even last 2 seconds as Tao Ji's magical power was simply too high and his mana reserve was still large, unlike Wu Yijun who was beginning to run out of fuel. Boom! The water and lightning tornado exploded and the water swirled even more, shaking the bodies of everyone except Tao Ji who was able to stand his ground thanks to his kind that helped him move through the water with ease. Bai Zemin rushed forward without hesitation and Shangguan Bing Shui immediately followed a step behind. They both understood that they had to seize the opportunity that Wu Yijun and Shangguan Xinyue had gained. It was going to be much easier to deal with the apocalyptic tornado now that it had weakened, but if they didn't hurry the power of the skill would increase again since there was water everywhere. Effect Anti-Magic has been successfully triggered and you have nullified an enemy magic skill. Bai Zemin rejoiced in his heart as when the skill entered the area of effect of his domain the magic of the tornado was cancelled. However, this did not mean that the tornado itself had disappeared. He allowed himself to be drawn into the eye of the storm and with a fierce swing from back to front struck annihilation of the falling sky against the tornado wall, rumbling the heavens, shaking the earth. Boom! Shangguan Bing Shui struggled against the water pressure and the subway waves trying to shake her body. When the water tornado exploded after being blown by Bai Zemin's physical attack, she rushed past him and planned to use the bubbles and out-of-control water as cover to attack the enemy. However, she suddenly saw a flash of red light flying towards her and her movements froze. It was all too fast. Not even a second had passed since she had passed Bai Zemin when Shangguan Bing Shui felt a hand on her shoulder and before she could do anything her body was sent flying to the left by strength she couldn't fight against. Die! Tao Ji roared with bloodshot eyes. He was furious, annoyed beyond explanation. Therefore, he used the power of his trump card again even though he believed it was not necessary. His mind had become clouded and he wanted nothing more than to make his enemies suffer. To finish them off in the worst possible way had become his goal. It would all be over in a second now. It's not that easy to kill me. Bai Zemin extended both hands forward and activated the power of the third skill he had made go up in order when he activated soul manipulation. Tao Ji stared with a fierce smile on his face as the waters of the sea were dyed red under the powerful crimson glow of the energy beam shot from the bottom of the waters. 1, 2, 3. Under her mask, Shangguan Bing Shui's face was so white that it was terrifying. She watched in a daze as the glow of light from the crimson energy beam covered the entire area. The energy beam was as thick as a large building. It was impossible to completely dodge it unless one could move at absurdly high speeds. Her lips moved, but no sound came out of her mouth other than a small whimper. She was in shock as she looked at the place where Bai Zemin had been before. Shangguan Bing Shui's brain had not yet understood or processed what had just happened. It was difficult for her to associate Bai Zemin with the words death and defeat. However, the 2 rows of crystalline tears that fell from her numb eyes as she stared straight ahead seemed to suggest that she knew in her heart that it was impossible to survive in front of something like that. Shangguan Xinyue was in a daze as well while looking at the flash of bright light, but unlike her daughter, she closed her eyes after the first 3 seconds and sighed sorrowfully. However, she opened them again a moment later and a fierce glint shone in her gaze. Things had already reached a point of no return. Shangguan Xinyue had raised Shangguan Bing Shui alone, had seen her grow up, and was certainly not going to see her die. Her daughter was going to bury her corpse or not the other way around. After about 5 seconds, Tao Ji sent a remote command and at the same time as the beam power gradually weakened, he began to laugh. Ha 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 ha. Even if you are a genius, so what? At the end of the day you can't. Suddenly, Tao Ji's words got stuck in his throat and his eyes almost popped out of their sockets while looking ahead. What? What's that? He muttered with wide eyes as he stared at what appeared to be a pure white sphere, about 10 centimeters in diameter. If you want to kill me first, you'll have to leave several teeth behind. Bai Zemin gritted his teeth and tried to ignore his current state and the pain that overwhelmed him. Tao Ji's face could not turn pale, or at least it could not be seen since there were scales covering his skin. However, his face certainly would have turned deathly pale if it were possible when he saw that white sphere suddenly turn red. White hole, expel energy. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 987 Wall of Chaos. More than a month ago, Cram World. When Lucifer's words regarding the invasion of the universe came out of his mouth, everyone in the room fell silent to the point that not even the inhalations and exhalations of the members of the demonic army could be heard. From a certain point of view, it could be said that the quietest among those present was none other than Lilith. This was because all the higher existences present in the room, except for her, had already participated in at least one war against the invaders and survived to tell the tale. How can this be possible? Fire Sorrow slowly sat up as she stared at the huge crimson crack that seemed to be the representation of the entrance to hell itself. They always invaded once every 1,000 years at most, and that amount of time was already too short for us to refill our ranks. But now we are being attacked more often than before? The birth of a higher existence was not a particularly normal occurrence regardless of how vast the universe was. Even if one set aside the fact that not all planets with living beings were evolving as they had not yet met the requirements to be visited by the soul record, a higher existence could only be born when soul evolvers reached level 400, completed at least 50% of their evolution requirements, and met a member of one of the 8 major factions who would immediately inform the leader of their faction, which would lead to the recruitment of said soul evolver. Level up to level 400 could take thousands of years, and only the true genius elites among the geniuses could reach that level if they did not fall on the way. The universe had no shortage of stars, but many of them fell and faded before they could even show their maximum splendor. With so many obstacles in the way, the 8 factions had to strive to recruit as much as they could, but it was impossible to recover in less than 10,000 years from the losses suffered by each of them after fighting the invaders. With luck, there were perhaps 10 living beings in the entire universe who ascended to the ranks of higher existences per year, and those 10 were divided into 8 groups. Even if within the 7,000 to 8,000 year time limit a faction managed to make up a few thousand of the previous loss, it still wouldn't be enough and the next war would weaken them even more. Fire Sorrow's concern was one they all understood and sympathized with, but there was little they could do in this regard. When? Lucia asked in an emotionless voice. Could be today, could be tomorrow, could be next week or next month. Lucifer took back the device and said in a deep voice, "It's impossible to know for sure, especially now that this irregularity is taking place. But, it will certainly be soon and we need to get ready for it." Under the watchful eyes of everyone, Lucifer stood up and said in a cold voice, "I hope everyone here has been able to live a good life so far, and in case you have loved ones, hope you have been able to say some nice words." "What do you mean by that?" Lilith asked with a frown of apprehension. "It means that the odds of many of us here present dying are not low." Lucifer turned the table around and walked to the giant stone door, and when he opened it he saw the hallway filled with members of his faction standing with serious expressions. "Little kids, I'm sorry to have to risk your lives, but I really have no choice." "What are you saying, Your Majesty?" Valiant walked to the door and said in a firm voice, "Most if not all of us would have died wrinkled with old age by now if it weren't for you. Your Majesty gave us years of life by making us part of the demonic army. Some have lived centuries and some millennia longer than expected, others have met the love of their lives after living thousands of years in solitude after arriving here. It is only natural that we fight for our home." Valiant was certainly an exceptional general. Although she appeared to be an emotionless soul evolver as she never reflected any in either her voice or her actions or expressions, she definitely knew what to say to fan the flames in the heart of the army. "It's just like Miss Valiant just said. Fight, fight. Who is the one to smash this time? Don't tell me it's those pesky white pigeons. Ha ha ha, as if. Those angels know they can't beat us with their numbers. Now that His Majesty put on his battle gear, it means someone will definitely suffer. Bring it on. Let's show them that our leader is no freak." Lucifer looked at the battle flame burning in everyone's eyes and nodded. "All right, let's go ahead and get started then." Lucifer stamped softly on the stone floor and said in a deep voice, Alistar, wake up. Time to fight. Then, something that left many, even Lilith, breathless, occurred. The castle walls released a faint but obvious pale blue glow, and in a minute the entire structure flashed. Then, an old voice rang in everyone's ears. Looks like peace is over, huh? Old friend. Except for those higher existences who had been part of the demonic army for over 8,000 years. Everyone else was surprised when they felt the walls of the giant castle rumbling with every word from the unknown voice. Nothing big, just taking out the junk. The usual. Lucifer waved a hand casually. Ha 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 ha. The entire castle shook. All right, to the dump then, is that it? To the dump. Lucifer nodded and soon everyone felt a huge magic circle trigger outside the castle moments. Before a great amount of magical power and spatial laws began to shake Cram World, the castle. Lilith stood in awe as she watched everything around her slowly become slightly more blurry and shaky than before. She knew that the castle itself was an artifact, a creation that had been formed through forging, construction, rune encryption, and many other more areas such as magical engineering. However, this was the first time Lilith and many others had heard the castle speak. This castle is not just a normal artifact. Fire Sorrow stood up and said in a serious voice, Alistar, this entire castle is His Majesty Lucifer's soul armament. Soul armament. The entire castle. Lilith muttered in a voice that only she could hear, and as she recalled the thousands of cannons with enough power to threaten higher existences installed on the fortress walls, she couldn't help but sigh. Although Lilith naturally knew that annihilation of the falling sky was a sealed soul armament, the visual difference was colossal when compared to Alistar, Lucifer's castle. If not for the fact that she didn't think everyone was having fun joking about it, Lilith would have thought that there was no way annihilation of the falling sky was a more powerful soul armament than this giant fortress. We've arrived. Lucifer's voice brought everyone out of the sack of surprise they had entered, and it was only then that they realized that the castle no longer glowed, the surroundings no longer rumbled, and the spatial laws had returned to normal. However, when Lilith looked out the large window, she noticed that although she had not actually taken a step, she was no longer in her previous location. Let's go. Lucifer moved forward and the Fifth Order stalks opened to the sides. The Seventh Order generals followed closely behind with Lilith that possessed power equivalent to that of a Seventh Order Soul Evolver being the only exception to this rule. With Lucifer leading the way and the most powerful a few steps behind him, the rest followed. As they walked out of the castle, more members of the demonic army were hovering in the emptiness with their wings outstretched or standing with serious expressions in the front courtyard. Lilith did not know how many members of the demonic army were present, but it was definitely at least 1 or 2 million. She had only seen this kind of accumulation only once, and that was during the war against the other factions of higher existences in which she participated for the sake of gaining the right of ownership over a world that had just ascended. Despite being so many numerically speaking, no one said anything, and instead of asking questions, they followed in the footsteps of their leader. It was after approaching the edge of the front courtyard that Lilith realized they were actually in outer space. The castle was on a platform, and as she looked around, Lilith could see that there were some higher existences, belonging to other factions, suspended in the empty space. Lucifer stopped for a moment as he saw the other leaders advancing in his direction before saying something to Lucia and Fire Sorrow and finally moving towards them. Medes of the army of heaven accompanied by 2 well-known archangels, Gabriel and Uriel. Ledhar of the heavenly moon army accompanied by 2 Seventh Order werewolves. Salazar of the evolution army accompanied by 2 zombie females, both had red eyes and shared a striking beauty. They were Seventh Order powerhouses. Last but not least, a mind-blowingly beautiful crimson-haired female, barely an inch below Uriel and Lilith, advanced with 4 pairs of fiery wings blazing behind her. At her side were 2 Seventh Order Soul Evolvers as well. You came, Lucifer. The first to speak was Meads, who had a slight pious, gentle smile on his face. Of course. Though I'd rather not have to. Lucifer snorted. Ledhar looked at the troops of the demonic army and said in a serious voice, "This is quite an anomaly even if they are only 10 years in advance. We will be watching beyond the wall of chaos, and if it becomes absolutely necessary we will step in." Heh. Lucifer scoffed but said nothing. Step in? As if. Lucifer knew that for everyone present, the demonic army would be weakened meant good news in many ways and aspects. What Ledhar meant was probably the same thing they were all thinking, that if the demonic army showed signs of failing to stop the invaders they would lend a hand, but not for the sake of saving Lucifer's troops, but because they could not allow the enemy to reach beyond the wall of chaos and move through the universe at will. So, Nikolai and the little dragon boy didn't come? Lucifer looked around and noticed that 3 leaders were missing, but Star Devourer's absence was not a surprise at all. The little dragon boy is still recovering from what happened in the constellation of the Heavenly Wolf. The fiery red-haired woman, leader of Endless Crimson Flame, sneered. Well, the dragon god realm has been quieter than usual after what happened in the outskirts of the Heavenly Wolf constellation. Just as Eternal pointed out just now. Mead sighed. As for Nikolai, he's been investing quite a bit of time and resources to search for worlds belonging to the dragon god realm. It's likely he wants revenge. No wonder. Salazar chuckled sardonically and pointed out, Long Tion ambushed and killed one of Nikolai's generals, and an extremely popular one at that. Things will definitely get interesting soon, if we manage to survive, that is. Lucifer yawned. His words silenced everyone for a moment as they stared at the large crimson crack in the distance. As Lucifer exchanged words with the other higher existence leaders, Lilith and several other higher existences coming to this place for the first time looked at the large crimson crack with wide eyes. However, what surprised Lilith the most was not the crack itself, since even though this was the first time she had seen it in person, she had at least heard and read about it in some books of the demonic army. What surprised Lilith the most was the wall whose end was nowhere in sight, that stretched both lengthwise and breadthwise in such a way that the universe itself seemed to be being cut apart and detached. What is that? She murmured with eyes filled with wonder. Crow looked at her in confusion before his eyes flashed with compression. Right. This is your first time participating in a war against the invaders, Lilith. It's only natural that you don't know about the Wall of Chaos since there aren't even records of its existence. Wall of Chaos? That's its name. Crow nodded. His mood was clearly not good. His expression was serious, and he didn't even feel like flirting with Lilith, proof of how worrisome the current situation was. The Wall of Chaos has been there seemingly forever. Even Fire Sorrow admitted many years ago that when she ascended along with His Majesty Lucifer and Lucia, the Wall of Chaos was already in this place. Even older than Lucifer and Fire Sorrow. Lilith could feel her heart tremble as she looked at the slightly brownish-colored wall in the distance. The Wall of Chaos is the last defense of the universe. It is there to prevent invaders from entering our universe and causing disasters. Crow added in a serious voice. The Wall of Chaos cannot be destroyed even with the strength of the leaders of the 8 factions working together. Instead, our attacks will be absorbed and further increase the power of the wall. It is said that if the Soul Record deems us to fail in our mission to repel the invaders, it will explode the wall, killing everything on this side regardless of whether it is an ally or not. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse, Chapter 988, Beginning of the War Against the Invaders. There were many things Lilith did not know about the universe, which was completely normal, considering that the universe was older than any living thing. Well, maybe the Soul Record was as old as the universe, but such a thing was impossible to know for sure. After all, the Soul Record was a mystery of equal or even greater magnitude than the universe. However, the more she learned, the more she realized how small her existence was. She was the bloody succubus Lilith, feared and worshipped by countless in the most optimal sense of the word. a sixth-order higher existence with a battle power comparable to that of an archangel or general demon. And yet, even though the number of living beings capable of standing up to her in the entire universe was so small, she realized day after day that she was no more than an insignificant speck of dust that the natural wind of life could shake to and fro at will. Approximately 50 minutes later, Lucifer returned and Lilith saw the other leaders of higher existences using their pagodas to teleport out of the wall of chaos. Fire Sorrow approached him, and after exchanging a few words using whispers that only they could hear, she turned to look at the waiting troops. Some members of the demonic army were standing on the highest part of the castle, some were on the walls, and some were in the courtyard, but most of them were hovering in the outer space around the fortress with black, raven-like wings moving behind their backs. Most of us here are at least several tens of thousands of years old, so we already know what we will face. Even if the war came 10 years earlier than expected, it's not news to us what will come out of the abyssal rift, nor is the fact that at least 10% of everyone here will lose their lives. Fire Sorrow's voice was not too loud, but everyone heard it clearly. Most of those present, those whom Fire Sorrow was talking to, had serious expressions on their faces. Some of them subconsciously tightened their grip on their weapons as they recalled events of the last war against the beings living beyond the abyssal rift, and for the first time in her life, Lilith saw the proud higher existences always looking down on all life showing signs of fear. Not enough to make them flee, but enough to make it clear that the enemy was really strong. However, there are many brothers and sisters who joined our demonic army less than 10,000 years ago. Therefore, they don't know much about the current situation. Fire Sorrow looked at Lilith for a moment before continuing. The first thing you need to know is that the enemy faction comes from a place called the Golden Domain. As for what the Golden Domain is like, what lies beyond the abyssal rift, I'm afraid that's a question no one can answer, since we don't even know what this place called the Golden Domain is, to begin with. The only reason we know the name of the place where our enemies live is because they can communicate with us, but don't expect to get much information from them, as you will end up disappointed. Lilith, like all the relatively new members of the demonic army, had many questions. However, she kept quiet, trying to absorb as much information as possible to have a better chance of surviving what was to come. She couldn't fall here no matter what. Not now that she was finally being happy again. Lucifer looked at everyone with a serious expression that many were seeing for the first time and said in a deep voice, "Our enemy's goal is simple, to kill us. They treat us as harvest, but what little do they know is that in the end, they will end up running away with their tails between their legs as usual. We have two goals, both of which are easy to understand but perhaps not easy to achieve. Kill as many enemies as possible and survive." Lucifer and Fire Sorrow passed the microphone to each other. Both spent over 2 hours trying to give as much information as possible to the members of the demonic army that they thought might become essential in battle. Finally, 2 things I want you all to keep in your heads. Lucifer soared above everyone, flapping 4 pairs of wings as black as night, and said in a deep voice, "First, those who survive this time will probably go up a few levels and become much stronger. Second, even though our enemies look like us, you can consider them as completely different beings. Dogs if you want. Let's fight and survive, everyone." Fire Sorrow nodded before beginning to prepare multiple magical arrays all over the place with the help of other old mages. Time passed, and in what for these beings who could theoretically live until the end of time was no different than the blink of an eye, 2 weeks flew by. The stamina of the higher existences would not drop even 1 point even if they did not sleep for many years, as long as they did not do anything great. Therefore, no one slept but stood attentively gazing into the ever-growing abyssal rift with Lucifer and the generals of the demonic army in front. 2 weeks after arriving at the Chaos Wall, the signal that the war was about to begin came naturally without anyone having to do anything at all. Rumble. The distant but not so distant abyssal rift began to shake with increasing frequency and force to the point where the entire universe seemed to be rumbling. Lucifer ordered all members of the faction to stand back and stay on the castle walls while he himself moved forward. What is he doing? Lilith asked with a frown. Don't tell me he wants to fight alone? Could it be that after not sleeping for half a month the great demon lord had gone mad? This was the question that the newest members of the demon army were pondering in their hearts. There is no way I can single-handedly win, Lucifer replied from a distance as he kept his eyes on the large crimson mouth. Although I am considered one of the 8 most powerful beings in the universe, even I can die. Not for nothing did I form a faction, you know? The strength of a single individual can only do that much. After a few seconds of silence, and just as what appeared to be a human leg emerged from inside the rift, Lucifer said in a low but extremely clear voice to most, "But I think I can at least give our uninvited guests a nice welcome." Though she had been warned and somewhat expected it, Lilith's ruby eyes widened slightly as the first invader finally arrived on the battlefield. Wearing a sky-blue robe and with a sword at his waist, the invader, whose black hair was neatly trimmed, looked at the surroundings with a shocked expression on his face, as proof that this was his first time coming here. He looked exactly like an ordinary human being, except that his aura was something Lilith had never felt before. No. When she narrowed her eyes and sharpened her senses, Lilith realized that she had felt that kind of aura somewhere before. Unfortunately, she couldn't remember it for now, and the enemy certainly didn't plan to give her time to think. 1, 2, 3, 4. The enemies continued to come faster and faster and without stopping. The rift they were coming through was big enough for thousands of people to pass through at the same time, so that in a matter of seconds the demonic army was facing a budding army of invaders coming from the so-called Golden Domain. Some were carrying swords, others were using spears, giant maces, warhammers, halberds, etc. Some even used musical instruments such as flutes or zither. They looked no different from a normal army that everyone was used to seeing practically every day. Heh. Lucifer snorted with a cold smile and said to himself, "You guys want to wait to be more before attacking? This isn't a fantasy book, little brats. And I'm not a general nice enough to wait for you to settle up." Lucifer's 8 wings opened wide and the mana in his body began to slowly decrease as the giant castle began to shake and glow. "Alastar, go crazy. Ha 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 ha." The laughter from the castle was loud enough to make some weaker 5th-order existences feel dizzy, and the invaders became a bit alert as they saw the glow beginning to become strong enough to illuminate this large patch of the universe. "Lucifer, you have been sleeping for so long that I had forgotten how the blood of these little children is." Sensing the power of the enemy weapon increasing non-stop to the point of becoming a threat, one of the invaders at the front said in a deep voice, "Everyone, the enemy seems to be preparing a full-scale attack. Although the leaders this time have not yet arrived and we were ordered not to move too far away from the gate, no one said anything about not attacking from afar, or did they?" A warrior with a green-colored spear stepped forward and shouted excitedly, "Ceremony of the Hurricane." Strange energy different from mana surged from the warrior's body, and in an instant, a large amount of wind-like energy gathered at the tip of his spear. Swoosh! A giant tornado, but still small compared to the rift, shot out at full speed from the tip of the spear towards the demonic army. Seeing this, many more launched their own attacks without delay. They had no sequence in their movements and did not listen to each other since they did not really belong to the same army even if they were fighting together. Giant sword slashes, hot fireballs as big as the sun, lightning spears, strange sound waves, and a lot more. Lilith could feel that those attacks were all equivalent to those of geniuses among the geniuses of every 5th-order soul evolver. Some could even be compared to attacks from 6th-order existences. Was this just the advance army? If that was the case, then what was to come? Lilith took a deep breath and finally realized why all the factions of higher existences suffered disastrous losses every time they faced these enemies. They were truly terrifying. Fire Sorrow took a step forward and the 6 wings behind her flapped gently as she extended her right hand to the front elemental shield. Fire Sorrow's whisper had barely fallen when a semi-transparent barrier with motes of light within it stretched, for what seemed like thousands of miles, parting the enemy and the demonic army as the wall of chaos separated this battlefield from the universe they needed to protect. Boom, boom, boom. Explosions of apocalyptic magnitude were going off again and again. Rumble. As the entire battle zone rumbled, one of the invaders scoffed at the sight of the explosions filled with bright flashes. I was eager to be part of this generation as I wanted to come and harvest some benefits in this place, but it seems our enemies are no big deal after all. However, a few seconds later and at the same time as the layer of fire and lightning covering the area disappeared, that same invader was forced to swallow his words when he saw the purple-haired woman looking at them with a faint disdainful smile. Kids these days really have no sense of manners. Fire Sorrow chuckled as she reached down and cancelled her barrier. They hadn't even managed to crack it, let alone break through it. Since they've already sent their greeting, it's time for us to send ours. Lucifer snorted and said in a deep voice, Alistar, make sure you welcome them properly. A total of 8,400 greetings on order. On the way out, at the same time as the voice from the castle boomed in the surroundings, the 8,400 secondary cannons glowed and under the wide eyes of the Golden Domain invaders blasted out. The entire battlefield seemed to light up with blue flashes of light to the point of becoming a bit blinding. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 989, The Cunning of a Lazy Man. The invaders coming from whatever was beyond the abyssal rift only saw thousands of flashes of pale blue light, approaching at breakneck speeds from the bright spot that was the enemy castle. Dodge. The quickest to react hurriedly moved through space, performing evasive moves in an attempt to dodge the enemy attack. Even if they were confident, they certainly weren't stupid enough to take head-on an attack that even from a distance had enough power to burn their eyes out as it approached. However, it was only the invaders who had movement abilities that managed to dodge the first beams. The others were simply not that lucky. Bright sword flashes flew everywhere in the sky, and the sound of the melody coming from the magical musical instruments of each invader helped to weaken the enemy's attack power a bit. However, none of this did any good at all. Boom. 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 The sword flashes were shattered and the beams fired from the cannons of the demonic army's castle continued to advance with no obstacle able to stop them at all. Each beam exploded with the power of a high-magnitude atomic bomb when it hit the body of an invader, making them blow up into millions of pieces. Just the shockwave from each blast was enough to damage all the invaders near the center of the explosion. Severity, and when their bodies were shaken they could do nothing before a cannon beam turned them into minced meat. As the seconds ticked by, the members of the demonic army watched speechlessly as the sky lit up at the glare of each shot fired from the fortress cannons. About 90% of the time, each shot resulted in the death of at least one invader. As for the remaining 10%, tens if not hundreds of enemies were sent flying back with red blood pouring from their bodies and floating into space. This was the first time most of those present had seen the power of the castle they often visited, and all of them admitted in their hearts that it was terrifying. Each invader has strength equivalent to a 5th-order soul evolver at the very least. There are even some comparable to 6th-order beings. A demon with 2 pairs of black wings, indicative of his status as a 6th-order demon, sighed and said in admiration, but in front of His Majesty Lucifer they all fall like flies. They can't even defend, forget about fighting back. Everyone felt considerably optimistic about this war. Even those who had participated in previous wars against the Golden Domain felt that way, since this time Lucifer was using the power of his soul armament without inhibitions. Only a handful among the members of the demonic army realized that while it was true that the power of Alistar, the name of Lucifer's soul armament, was terrifying, the reality was that the consumption of using it was not small. Lilith looked at Lucifer's back with an indifferent expression and calmly commented, "His Majesty Lucifer's mana has dropped quite a lot of the total in such a short time, if I'm not wrong. It seems that his soul armament really is a big glutton. Beautiful little lady, do you think I can fire these cannons at will any time I feel like it?" Lilith jumped in surprise when the voice from the castle spoke to her. "Alistar, stop flirting." Lucifer rolled his eyes as he retracted his wings and landed in front of the first wall. "Leave me alone," the castle growled. After about a minute, the cannon fire stopped and the members of the demon army didn't know if this was because the demon lord wanted to save energy or if it was because there were no longer any enemies to shoot at. That's right, there were no more enemies in front of them. They had all been slaughtered. However, quickly more and more were coming out of the abyssal rift, so it was only a matter of time before their ranks would recover. Well, that was about 600,000 invaders to me. Lucifer looked at Hellscar and said calmly, "Hellscar, do you want to take some young kids and have some fun? Can I really do that?" Hellscar roared with bloodshot eyes as he stared at the enemies in the distance like a rabid dog. "If you don't want to, it's fine." Lucifer shrugged at him. "Brats, follow this master. It's time to kill some little pieces of shit." Hellscar didn't dare to linger any longer, and with a fierce flapping of the 6 black wings behind his back, he turned into a lightning flash in the direction of the enemy army. Seeing that the members of the faction were looking at him, Lucifer motioned with his head towards the enemy army to indicate that it was all right to follow Hellscar, and when the demons saw this they stopped hesitating. Hellscar arrived before the enemy ranks in a matter of blinks, and an invader whose strength was comparable to that of a 6th order demon advanced to attack him. "Sunfire slash!" the invading warrior roared as he slashed with his sword horizontally. A giant crescent-shaped flame, seemingly capable of incinerating everything, shot out from the blade of the male invader's sword. As the crescent-shaped flame moved away and advanced towards its target, its size grew more and more terrifying, and the power with which it burned did not stop escalating to the point where some invaders had no choice but to move back. "Die!" Hellscar roared even louder than his enemy, and without holding back at all he punched forward using his right fist covered by a large gauntlet as a weapon. Boom! The seemingly normal, small fist clashed with the sunfire slash of the enemy that was as large as the entirety of Beijing. Despite the huge difference in size, however, the fire attack was crushed and even space itself trembled. Ugh! The invader hurriedly retreated as he felt the blood inside his body stirring after being hit by the resulting force of the enemy fist. His attack had been shattered by a mere punch, without even the use of skills or abilities, and despite the distance, he was still injured by the remaining strength of the enemy fist. When the invader raised his head and prepared to attack again a second later, his pupils contracted to the size of needles and his face went deathly pale. Boom! After ending the life of one of the most powerful invaders among the present ones, Hellscar did not stop and with a bestial roar advanced. It didn't take him long to reach the enemy army, and soon his fists turned into something similar to meat grinders, since only one blow of his punches was more than enough to explode the bodies of all the invaders that were in the area of effect of the shockwave. When approximately 20% of the total members of the demonic army joined the fray, the invading troops began to be slaughtered unilaterally with such ease that those watching from behind wondered if they would really be needed in this battle. However, after about an hour or so, things changed. From the abyssal rift, along with a large army of over 500,000 invaders, an existence whose aura sent shivers down the spine of even those higher existences who had already planted their feet firmly within the 6th order many years ago. An invader swiftly retreated just in time to avoid the lethal slash of the sword of a 5th order demonic army's member at the same time as his bleeding finger struck one of the 8 strings of his zither. "Infernal purge!" the invader roared. The 5th order demon's movements froze for a second, and without even a cry of pain, his head exploded into 1,000 pieces. The invader with the zither sighed in relief at the sight of the jade-green robed man with a jade-green spear. This invader was incredibly handsome, so much so that most men present were unable to hold a candle to him. However, his expression was incredibly arrogant even after seeing those who were apparently his fellow teammates being slaughtered. This man's name was Lin Qinyu, and he was considered a genius in his faction back in the Golden Domain. His sky-blue eyes rested on Hellscar and his lips curved into a sardonic smile. "Cloud steps. Hellscar had just crushed a dozen invaders equivalent to fifth-order soul evolvers when he suddenly sensed danger and out of pure instinct leaned back in a hurried motion. Boom! Despite his excellent reaction, Hellscar was still hit and his plate armor sank inward into the left shoulder area as his body was forced back hundreds of meters. Lim Qingyu coldly snorted and pursued. His emerald-colored spear glowed and before Hellscar could fully stabilize his body, what appeared to be the ghost of a giant tree appeared behind him. Serenity of vulnerabilities. Lim Qinyu's voice had barely fallen when Hellscar finally managed to stabilize. However, it was at that moment that the ghost of the tree behind him charged into his body and in an instant, Hellscar felt his power falling. Lim Qinyu did not stop there as he quickly stabbed forward with a graceful yet fierce move, Forest Fiend Stab. Hellscar roared and with a lightning-fast movement unsheathed the giant sword that had rested on his back all, this time. Fury burst. Soon, the spear and the giant sword met at a midpoint. Boom! An explosion that surpassed all the previous ones by a considerable margin sent every living thing within a 1,000-kilometer radius flying with the point of impact between the two weapons as the center, be it invader or defender. The lucky ones escaped with injuries and the unlucky ones were killed outright. It was thanks to this first clash that the two monsters were soon left alone on their own battlefield while the others went at each other's throats. For the first 30 minutes it seemed that Hellscar was at a slight disadvantage, but after 40 minutes of battle the scales began to tip in his side and 50 minutes after the first clash Lim Qinyu found himself gritting his teeth and grunting as he did his best to block his opponent's increasingly unrestrained attacks. Die! 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 Hellscar seemed to have gone mad as he had given up most of his defense while seeking to shatter his enemy's body with attacks that lacked elegance but held enough power to make space tremble every time he swung his giant sword surrounded by a strange fiery red fire-like energy. From a distance, Lucia watched the battle unfold and said in an emotionless voice, "You did plan it, didn't you, Imim?" Lucifer looked sideways at her with a confused expression on his face. "You left Hellscar locked up for all this time, precisely aiming for this." Lucia pointed in a flat voice and without taking her eyes off the ongoing battle voiced her thoughts. The skill rage of ancestors is one that all members of Hellscar's race are born with, but his was particularly strong from a young age. This skill forces him to fight and kill at least once every certain short period of time or else the user will accumulate all that battle drive, which when exploited will take away some of their sanity in exchange for a steady increase in power. And so? Lucifer raised an eyebrow in puzzlement. "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you? That's why you locked Hellscar up, to have him at full strength." Lucia finally looked at him. Hellscar might not be the smartest or even the most acute when it came to thinking or planning. However, when it came to battle power and effectiveness on the battlefield, probably only 3 or 4 in the entire demonic army were capable of surpassing him when he was at his peak. Lucifer gave Lucia a sidelong glance before turning his attention back to the front. After a moment of silence, he said in a bored voice, "Sis, aren't you overestimating me? I just happened to forget Hellscar locked in that subdimension, that's all." "A great misfortune, indeed." "Misfortune, you say?" "If you say so, then let's say that's the case then." Lucia shook her head saying no more. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 990 Lilith's Turn. Lilith listened to the brother-sister duo's conversation from a few meters away, and when she looked at Lucifer's back she couldn't help but sigh in her heart. Really, none of the 8 leaders could be underestimated. Even Lucifer, apparently lazy and unwilling to waste energy on thinking, was truly terrifying. "Don't look at me like that, bloody succubus," Lucifer said suddenly and looked over his shoulder at her. "I don't think the lower existence who gave you that earring would like it if he knew you were staring so intently at another man you know. You." Lilith frowned and a flash of anger shone in her pupils. "Why are you getting angry? You make it look like you're really in a sentimental relationship with a lower existence." Lucifer's green-colored eyes flashed slightly as he said these words. And ignoring Lilith's reaction, he turned his attention back to the battlefield. We are all just spectators. Well, small players on a big board. Fire Sorrow is like that, Lucia is like that, I am like that. And even you are just a small player within the big board, though perhaps a bit more important than us. Lucifer shrugged as flashes of light from the explosions on the distant battlefield illuminated his silhouette, and that of the rest behind him. This war against the Golden Domain will probably be the toughest to date, not only of the ones our demonic army fought, but of all the ones fought so far as well, and I'm sure it won't stop getting worse from here on out. Who knows, the next one could be much sooner than expected. Valiant looked at Lucifer for a few seconds before calmly saying, Your Majesty seems to know something we don't? Not much, really. Lucifer looked up at the giant crimson crack and said slowly, I've said it before, did you forget, Valiant? Valiant frowned slightly with a confused expression, and after a few seconds, Lucifer continued, Our universe has existed for a long time, and everything will eventually face its end. This is a rule that even I cannot break. Our universe is destined to reach an end, it's just a matter of how long. Unless something really big comes along, something capable of fighting against this unbreakable rule. It takes something to end for something new to begin. Fire Sorrow sighed and said softly, Every beginning happens because there was an ending before. Hopefully, whatever is to come we can see it through to the end, and with luck, we will be part of the new beginning. Crow's eyes darted back and forth between Lucifer, Fire Sorrow, and Lucia. He scratched his head and said in frustration, Arg, I have no idea what you three are saying. I get the beginning and end thing, but what's with all the philosophical talk? Wouldn't it be better to go finish off the enemy as soon as possible? How about I join Hellscar in killing that spear guy, HM? Or else it'll be days or even weeks before Hellscar can kill that Lance guy. Lucifer narrowed his eyes and said in a serious voice, Crow, get ready to fight. You're taking some of the troops with you. It's about time. Crow opened both hands and exhaled in relief. I was getting bored to death here. Don't worry, Your Majesty. With me and Hellscar joining hands, that invader will fall in no time. No. Lucifer interrupted, Your target is not Hellscar's enemy, your target is that one. Crow saw Lucifer nod toward the crimson crack, and just then a new figure, whose aura seemed to be comparable to that of Hellscar's enemy, appeared amidst the roars and curses along with apocalyptic explosions. Great. Crow narrowed his eyes and before dashing towards the battlefield at lightning speed ordered those behind him, Follow me. A good portion of the demonic army unsheathed their weapons and with powerful flapping followed Crow from a respectful distance. The new arrival possessed power equivalent to an archangel or demon general like Crow. His name was Han Jian, and just like Lin Qinyu, he was a genius, although the two were part of different factions. Han Jian looked ahead as he was thinking of going with his troops and joining the battlefield. However, his plans changed as he saw a new wave of enemies charging straight in their direction. The enemy leader is mine. You all can take care of the minions. Han Jian smiled and waved his whip outwards, taking advantage of that seemingly casual movement. He slashed towards Crow, Frost Lash. Accompanied by the terrifyingly swift movement of the whip, a good portion of the battlefield showed signs of freezing, and Crow immediately felt his skin turn goosebumps at the cold temperatures. Hell flame! Crow bellowed, and an instant later his entire figure was engulfed in a wide swirl of violet fire, crushing all the frost flying in his direction. Heh! Han Jian sneered, My Frost Lash isn't that easy to stop. Boom! Although Crow had managed to intercept the enemy's lash with his sword, his body froze in mid-flight. This greatly surprised all the members of the demonic army behind, and they subconsciously stepped back a few steps to avoid being hit by the aftershock. Sir Crow, how can this be possible? The members of the demon army could not believe what they were seeing. One of the demon lord's generals had been defeated this easily? Looks like I got one of the weaker ones. Han Jian shook his head scornfully before waving his whip fiercely towards Crow's frozen statue. Oh well, I'll get a nice reward when I get back just by taking your head, so I guess it's okay. Flash of frost. The deep blue whip in Han Jian's right hand turned into a flash of light, and in an instant struck the chest of the frozen crow. Boom! When the ice statue crashed, Han Jian's expression abruptly changed, and without even pausing to think he flew backwards in a hurry. Swoosh! Seeing a flare of purple fire falling from the sky above his head, Han Jian gritted his teeth and bellowed, "Heavy frost shield!" Boom! From amidst a pile of frost and shards of broken ice, as well as scattered flames, Han Jian jumped back as he looked at his enemy with a cold and serious expression on his face. "You don't seem to be smiling anymore? I like it better this way." Crow sneered. Soon, his eyes turned blood red as he cruelly said, "You survived the first one. Let's see if you can survive the ones to come." Soon, the members of the demonic army that followed Crow to this other battlefield within the all-out war began to fight fiercely against the new arrivals from beyond the abyssal rift. "Crow has improved again in his skills," Valiant commented with a nod. "Although his personality is a bit lecherous and arrogant, the fact that he is a genius in feint magic is irrefutable. His physical and magical attacks are also not weak at all." Fire Sorrow added, "Crow's personality was a bit troublesome, but nothing too big in the eyes of people like Valiant and the other demon generals. Besides, even if there was no mention of his talent, which certainly gave him the qualifications of being arrogant and prideful, Crow was completely loyal to the faction, and his contributions had been no small over the years. For better or worse, Crow was held in high regard by everyone in the demonic army." Lilith watched both battlefields with indifference and simply waited her turn to advance. 1 week later, the war on the Wall of Chaos simply grew fiercer and bloodier with each passing day. And by this point practically the entirety of the demonic army had been mobilized days ago and were currently fighting with their lives on the line against the invaders coming from beyond the abyssal rift. Valiant had joined the battle 2 days after the war broke out when a new enemy comparable to a demon general made her appearance. She was not as overwhelming and fatal as Hellscar, nor was she as cunning as Crow. However, Valiant was much more agile and balanced in terms of overall power. Therefore, although she showed no signs of defeating her enemy in the short term, Valiant certainly had an easier time on the battlefield when compared to the two aforementioned generals. Regarding Hellscar and Crow, both had suffered some low-medium grade wounds while fighting their enemies. But this was completely normal, considering that they were facing beings whose power rivaled theirs. However, it wasn't all about battle power. There was something that Hellscar and Crow had plenty of, but their enemies lacked: combat experience. Lim Qingyu and Han Jian had experienced a relatively smooth rise, and both were so young that they hadn't seen major setbacks to reach their current height. But Hellscar and Crow reached their current position of power after dancing hand in hand with the Reaper for most of their long lives. Fiery Tempest. Hellscar slashed with his two-handed sword wreathed in flames with such speed and power that Lin Qingyu was forced to retreat repeatedly while using all his learned techniques and skills to block. He didn't even have time to counterattack, and his body was filled with all sorts of bloody wounds. Chaos Storm. The black sword wreathed in purple flames in Crow's right hand was so fast that even Han Jian could barely keep up with it using his frost whip. In addition, the wounds that Crow's flame with corrupting properties had inflicted on Han Jian during the previous week had exhausted him so much that he could barely draw 70% of his full power, and it would only be a matter of time before he lost his head at this rate. Indeed, approximately 2 hours later, both Lim Qingyu and Han Jian coughed out fresh blood and were sent flying backwards at practically the same time after receiving a blow that left them with medium-high-grade injuries. The members of the demonic army cheered loudly as they saw that 2 of their generals managed to completely take the upper hand against the 2 enemy generals. During the past week, a total of 26.465 superior existences belonging to the demonic army had lost their lives while facing the invaders. Nearly 30.000 beings who were once admired and crowned as heroes and kings of their own worlds and races had fallen in such a short time. Considering that a higher existence was only rarely killed, this was an incredibly high number. Especially since the war still showed no signs of stopping, as even though over 1,740,000 invaders had been killed, more were still coming as if there was no end in sight. Hellscar and Crow's victory was no different than finding a woodshed with a warm fire in the middle of the forest on a cold winter's night. Just at that moment, two silhouettes wearing identical robes, which was a clear indicator that they were part of the same group, emerged from the abyssal rift. The aura of these two was chilling, and although only they had arrived on the battlefield this time, since the abyssal rift probably couldn't send anyone else given the power that both invaders had, the numbers certainly weren't a problem for these two recent arrivals. Looks like these old men are kicking our asses, Duan Dilan. One of them smiled slightly as he stroked his bowstring. The elders warned us not to underestimate some of these people, but some of them really don't learn. The young man named Duan Dilan shook his head as he unsheathed his sword. Although they look young, they are probably thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years old. It's a bit embarrassing to admit this, considering they are just our own livestock, but in terms of real experience it's true that we are below them. I'll join that fellow Lin Qinyu to deal with the big guy. Duan Dilan decided. In that case, I guess I am joining Han Jian then. The other young man, whose name was Di, nodded. At the same time, Lucifer looked indifferently at the two new invaders. After a moment of silence, he looked over his shoulder and calmly said, "Bloody succubus, it's your turn." Lilith nodded. She was brimming with energy since she hadn't participated in the battle for the past week. You don't need to directly fight any of those guys equivalent to a seventh order. Lucifer suddenly said. In that case. Lilith frowned in confusion. You will be the wild card in this war. Lucifer said as he looked out onto the battlefield. You will assist everyone, kill whoever you can while moving all over the place. With your overwhelming charm and crowd control ability, you will be able to completely overpower the enemy in a matter of days. Lilith looked at the chaotic battlefield with a cold expression. Blood floated next to incomplete corpses belonging to both allies and enemies. Shattered weapons and armors, ripped robes in tatters, and constant explosions capable of turning sizable cities to dust. Okay. Lilith nodded, and the two pairs of wings behind her opened wide. Her lips curved into a bewitching smile as she playfully whispered, "That's my preferred battle style after all."